Joint motions are usually described as the motion of one bone relative to another, and that is a great definition. But the working definition we use for many shoulder motions are actually in relation to the humerus compared to the rest of the body. So we have shoulder complex flexion, which looks like this, which is the overhead motion of the humerus overhead in the sagittal plane of the body. Not necessarily a specific relationship between the humerus and the scapula at the glenohumeral joint. Likewise, we have abduction, which is an overhead motion of the humerus in the frontal plane of the body. So again, we define those motions based on the relationship of the arm or the humerus with the torso or the rest of the body, not specifically with the scapula. Now, why that's important is if I have a slightly protracted clavicle, which brings the scapula with it, this is going to be flexion because I'm in the sagittal plane of the body. And if I retract a little bit and then do this motion, we would still call that flexion, even though the motion specifically is at the glenohumeral joint. And the same thing, as long as I'm within this frontal plane of the body, this is going to be considered abduction of the humerus at the glenohumeral joint. Now, when we do the full range of motion, we might call this flexion of the shoulder complex because it's going to involve motion at the glenohumeral joint, acromioclavicular joint, and sternoclavicular joint, just like any other fully overhead motion. So if I do abduction of the shoulder complex, that will be a combination of abduction specifically at the glenohumeral joint, upward rotation of the scapula at the AC joint, and elevation of the clavicle at the SC joint. Now, we also have this term scaption that means motion of the arm overhead in the plane of the scapula. Now, I don't think it's a bad definition. The plane of the scapula is about 30 degrees from the frontal plane. If you look at a wide range, you'll usually see anywhere from 30 to 40 degrees from the frontal plane. But the problem I have with it is when I've read a lot of articles or watched videos on scaption from health professionals, they tend to define it as one narrow, unmoving angle. But you got to remember that the scapula is free to move in the frontal plane, around the transverse plane, and yes, to some degree, even in the sagittal plane. So if we're talking about scaption and we're talking about movement in the frontal plane of the scapula, so if you talk about the plane that is most congruent with the broad area of the scapula, that could be considered the frontal plane of the scapula or the plane of the scapula. I would call it the frontal plane of the scapula specifically because, like any other 3D object, it's going to have three planes. So simply calling it the plane of the scapula, in my opinion, is just bad terminology. So I would define scaption as motion within the frontal plane of the scapula. So abduction would look like this, adduction like this, and if you want to look kind of down through the frontal plane, it would look like this and this. But the scapula is free to move at the AC joint, and it moves along with motion at the SC joint. So this might be considered the default for scaption, whereas if I retract my shoulder blade a little bit, we might call this abduction, but it would also be scaption because if I have retracted the scapula, and I'll probably get a little bit of external rotation of the scapula at the AC joint, now my abduction is actually lined up with the scapula. And if I do a little bit of protraction on purpose, I might be closer to like a 45-degree angle from the frontal plane when I do flexion and then come back down into extension, or I guess scaption on the way up, and then whatever they call the reverse of scaption on the way down.